The desert wind carried dust and the distant sound of rotor blades as the medical evacuation helicopter touched down at the forward operating base. Navy SEAL Team 7 had just returned from a mission that went sideways in the worst possible way. 3 wounded, 1 critical, and all of them carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed in that remote Afghan village. Hospital Corpsman Sarah Martinez stepped off the helicopter, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, and her face set in the focused expression that came with years of trauma medicine. She had been specially requested for this assignment, though the SEALs didn't know why yet. At 28, she looked younger than her years, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The base medic, Chief Petty Officer Johnson, briefed her quickly as they walked toward the medical tent. The wounded SEALs were stable but shaken. What had rattled the team most wasn't the firefight they'd survived, but what they'd found in that village. A massacre. Families executed, children among the dead. Even these hardened warriors were struggling to process what they'd seen. Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan, the team leader, watched the new medic approach with skeptical eyes. His left arm was bandaged from shrapnel, but he refused to lie down. Around him, his men sat in various states of injury and emotional exhaustion. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb had taken a bullet to the thigh and was trying to hide the tremor in his hands. Seaman Rodriguez nursed a concussion and kept staring at nothing, lost in whatever he was remembering. Sarah moved among them with quiet efficiency, checking vitals and assessing wounds. She worked without unnecessary chatter, her hands steady and sure, but it was her eyes that the SEALs noticed first. There was something in them, a depth of understanding that went beyond medical training. When she looked at Rodriguez, who was clearly struggling with what he'd witnessed, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and spoke so quietly that only he could hear. "The images will fade," she said simply, "but only if you let them." Rodriguez looked up at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. There was something about the way she said it, as if she knew from experience rather than textbook knowledge. Sullivan found himself studying this new medic more carefully. Most medical personnel were competent, but there was something different about Martinez. She moved through the wounded with an almost supernatural calm, as if chaos and trauma were familiar territory. When she cleaned his shrapnel wound, her touch was sure and practiced. But more than that, it was the touch of someone who understood what it meant to bleed for something bigger than yourself. "Where did you serve before this?" Sullivan asked as she worked. Sarah's hands paused for just a moment, so briefly that most people wouldn't have noticed. "Various places," she replied, continuing to clean the wound, wherever they needed medical support. It was a non-answer, and Sullivan knew it. In his experience, people who gave non-answers usually had interesting stories to tell. He filed the observation away, watching as she moved to help Webb with his leg wound. The young SEAL was trying hard to maintain his composure, but Sarah could see the signs of shock setting in. She worked quickly to stabilize the wound, then sat beside him on the medical cot. "First time seeing civilians caught in the crossfire?" she asked quietly. Webb nodded, not trusting his voice. "It never gets easier," Sarah said, her voice carrying a weight that made several of the other SEALs look over. "But you learn to carry it differently. You learn that honoring their memory means continuing to fight for others who can't fight for themselves." The words hit different coming from her. Most medical personnel offered comfort, but this felt like wisdom earned through fire. Sullivan exchanged glances with his men, all of them thinking the same thing. This wasn't standard bedside manner. This sounded like someone who had been exactly where they were now. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah continued her work, moving between patients with the kind of efficiency that only came from extensive field experience. She knew which pain medications worked best in high-stress situations, how to detect the early signs of PTSD, and most importantly, how to talk to warriors who had seen too much. When evening came and the wounded were stable, Sarah sat outside the medical tent, staring at the desert horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of other sunsets in other places she tried not to think about too often. Sullivan approached, his arm in a sling, but his curiosity too strong to ignore. "Mind if I sit?" She gestured to the empty space beside her on the wooden crate she was using as a chair. For a few minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. "You've been there," Sullivan said finally. It wasn't a question, Sarah looked at him, considering how much to reveal. In her experience, the truth had a way of coming out eventually anyway. "We've all been somewhere," she replied. "Not like that," Sullivan pressed gently. "The way you talked to my men today, the way you understood what they're going through, that doesn't come from medical school." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the familiar sounds of a military base settling in for the night. Guards calling out positions, the hum of generators, the soft conversations of soldiers trying to decompress from another day in a war zone. "Some stories take time to tell," she said finally. Sullivan nodded, understanding that he would have to earn whatever secret Sarah Martinez was carrying. But he was a patient man, and something told him that this medic's story was worth waiting for. As they sat there in the growing darkness, neither of them could have predicted how dramatically their lives were about to change, or how the events of the coming days would force Sarah to confront a past she had worked very hard to leave behind. 3 days later, the alarm that every soldier dreaded echoed across the forward operating base. Incoming mortars. The high-pitched whistle cut through the morning air, followed by the ground-shaking impacts that sent everyone scrambling for cover. Sarah was in the middle of changing Webb's bandages when the first explosion hit, close enough to rattle the medical equipment and send dust cascading from the tent ceiling. "Everyone down," Sullivan shouted, even though his men were already moving with practiced efficiency. Despite his injured arm, he grabbed his rifle and moved toward the tent entrance, scanning for threats. Sarah's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of diving for cover like most medical personnel would, she quickly secured her patient, then moved with military precision to gather essential medical supplies. Her movements were those of someone who had been under fire before, someone who knew that in combat situations, preparation could mean the difference between life and death. The mortar barrage continued for what felt like hours, but was actually only minutes. When it finally stopped, the base erupted into controlled chaos. Casualties were already being brought in from the perimeter guards, and Sarah found herself thrust into the kind of trauma surgery that most medics only read about in textbooks. The first wounded soldier came in with shrapnel embedded in his chest, blood soaking through his uniform. Sarah took one look at the wound and began issuing orders with an authority that surprised everyone in the tent. "I need pressure here, saline there, and get me a chest tube kit now," she commanded, her hands already working to control the bleeding. The base medic, Chief Johnson, moved to assist but found himself taking orders rather than giving them. "Martinez, where did you learn to—" Johnson began, but Sarah cut him off. "Questions later, save lives now," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Her hands moved with surgical precision, working to repair damage that would have challenged most field surgeons. Sullivan watched from his position near the tent entrance, his eyes widening as he observed Sarah work. This wasn't the careful, methodical approach of a hospital corpsman. This was battlefield surgery performed by someone who had clearly done it before under much worse conditions. The way she handled the trauma, the efficiency of her movements, the calm authority in her voice, it all pointed to extensive combat experience. More wounded kept coming. A soldier with severe burns from an ammunition explosion, another with a compound fracture from diving into a bunker. Each time, Sarah met the challenge with skills that seemed to exceed her apparent rank and position. She worked for 6 straight hours, saving lives that other medics might have lost. It was during the treatment of a young Marine with multiple shrapnel wounds that Sullivan noticed something that made his blood run cold. As Sarah bent over the patient, her sleeve rolled up slightly, revealing a tattoo on her forearm. It was small, partially hidden, but Sullivan recognized it immediately. It was the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment, specifically the distinctive scroll and star that marked someone as having served with one of the Army's most elite units. But that wasn't what shocked him most. What made him step closer for a better look was the small addition below the Ranger tab, a tiny medical cross with numbers beside it that indicated multiple combat deployments. This wasn't just any medic. This was someone who had served as a special operations medic with the Rangers, one of the most dangerous and demanding positions in the entire military. As the day wore on and the casualties were stabilized, Sullivan found himself watching Sarah more carefully. Now that he knew what to look for, other details became apparent. The way she automatically checked her 6 when moving between patients, how she positioned herself to always have an exit route, The unconscious way she evaluated every person who entered the medical tent, assessing them for potential threats. These weren't habits picked up during routine medical training. These were the ingrained behaviors of someone who had operated in hostile territory where medics were primary targets. When the crisis finally passed and the medical tent began to quiet down, Sarah sat heavily on a supply crate, finally allowing exhaustion to show on her face. Her scrubs were covered in blood, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline come down, but her patients were alive. All of them. Sullivan approached slowly, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything between them. 75th Ranger Regiment, he said quietly, making it a statement rather than a question. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of resignation and wariness. For a moment, the careful mask she had been wearing slipped, and Sullivan saw something raw and painful in her expression. "You've got good eyes," she said finally, rolling her sleeve down to cover the tattoo. "How many deployments?" Sullivan asked, sitting down across from her. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. 4 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. Mostly special operations support, some direct action missions. Sullivan felt the pieces clicking into place. Special operations medics didn't just treat wounded soldiers. They often fought alongside them, providing medical support during some of the most dangerous missions the military conducted. They were warriors first, medics second, and the training required to do both jobs simultaneously was brutal. "What happened?" he asked gently, sensing that there was more to the story. Sarah's expression hardened. "What always happens. Good people died and I couldn't save them all. After a while, the cost became too high." She stood up abruptly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I transferred to regular medical duties. Quieter assignments, less..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Less personal." But Sullivan could see through the careful explanation. In his experience, special operations personnel didn't just transfer to quieter duties unless something had gone very wrong. The fact that Sarah was here, in what was supposed to be a routine assignment, suggested that her past was more complicated than she was letting on. "The men you saved today," Sullivan said, standing to face her, "they're alive because you had skills that most medics don't. Whatever brought you here, I'm grateful for it." Sarah nodded, but Sullivan could see the weight she was carrying. Whatever had happened during her time with the Rangers, it was still haunting her. And as he watched her gather her medical supplies and prepare for the night shift, he couldn't shake the feeling that her past was going to catch up with her sooner than she expected. The attack on the base had been just the beginning. Intelligence reports were already coming in about increased enemy activity in the region, and Sullivan had a sinking feeling that the relatively quiet assignment Sarah had been hoping for was about to become anything but quiet. The secure communication came in at 0300 hours, waking Sullivan from the first decent sleep he'd had in days. The message was brief, but urgent. A ranger unit operating in the mountains had taken heavy casualties and needed immediate medical evacuation. Normal protocol would have been to send the base's regular medical team, but the request specifically asked for Hospital Corpsman Martinez by name. Sullivan found Sarah in the medical tent, restocking supplies for the next day. When he told her about the request, he watched her face go pale. "They asked for me specifically?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "By name and rank. Apparently someone up the chain knows about your background." Sullivan studied her reaction carefully. "You know something about this unit, don't you?" Sarah sat down heavily, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the medical supplies. 3rd Ranger Battalion, Alpha Company. They were my unit. Her voice was barely above a whisper. The unit I left behind. The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Sullivan understood immediately why this request was so difficult. Going back to help your former unit meant confronting whatever had made you leave in the first place. It meant facing the people who knew your story, your failures, your ghosts. "You don't have to go," Sullivan said gently. "I can tell command that you're needed here." Sarah shook her head. "If they're asking for me specifically, it means someone is badly hurt. Someone who knows that I'm the only medic who might be able to save them." She stood up, her military training overriding her personal reluctance. "How long until we leave?" "Wheels up in 30 minutes. The helicopter ride to the mountain extraction point was tense. Sarah sat in silence, checking and rechecking her medical gear with the kind of nervous energy that came from anticipating something you weren't sure you were ready for. Sullivan watched her from across the aircraft, noting how she seemed to shrink into herself as they got closer to their destination. When they finally touched down in a small clearing surrounded by rocky peaks, Sarah's entire demeanor changed. The hesitant, conflicted woman from the helicopter was replaced by the focused, determined special operations medic she had once been. It was like watching someone put on armor made of pure professionalism. The Rangers who met them at the landing zone were exactly what Sullivan expected. Lean, hard men with eyes that had seen too much. But their reaction to Sarah was what caught his attention. There was respect there, but also something else. Sadness, maybe. Or regret. Doc Martinez, the team leader, said, approaching with obvious relief. "Thank God you're here." "What's the situation, Sergeant Morrison?" Sarah asked, falling into step beside him as they moved toward the casualty collection point. "IED took out half the squad. We've got 2 KIA and 3 wounded, 1 critical. The critical is..." Morrison hesitated, then met Sarah's eyes directly. "It's Lieutenant Chen." Sarah stopped walking so abruptly that Sullivan nearly ran into her. The name obviously meant something significant, and from the look on her face, it wasn't good news. "Tommy Chen," she whispered. "Affirmative. Took shrapnel to the abdomen and lost a lot of blood before we could get him stabilized. He's been asking for you, Doc? Keep saying you're the only one who can fix him." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. When she opened them again, Sullivan saw something he hadn't seen before. Personal stakes. This wasn't just another patient. This was someone who mattered to her. They found Lieutenant Chen unconscious on a stretcher, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Sarah knelt beside him immediately, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed his condition. The wound was bad. Multiple entry points in his abdomen, internal bleeding, signs of shock. In a field hospital with full surgical capabilities, he might have a chance. Out here, with limited equipment and no backup, the odds were grim. "Tommy," Sarah said softly, checking his pulse. "Tommy, can you hear me?" Chen's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on her face. "Sarah, is that really you?" "It's me," she said, forcing a smile. "And I'm going to get you out of this mess just like old times." "Just like old times," Chen repeated weakly. Then his eyes closed again. Sullivan watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about a former unit member. The way Chen looked at Sarah, the familiarity in their interaction, suggested a relationship that went beyond professional. And judging by the pain in Sarah's eyes, it was a relationship that had ended badly. Sarah worked on Chen for 2 hours, performing surgery that should have been impossible under field conditions. She had Sullivan assist while the other Rangers provided security and evacuation support. Her hands never shook, her voice never wavered. But Sullivan could see the emotional toll it was taking. Every few minutes she would glance at Chen's face with an expression of desperate hope, mixed with barely contained fear. "Talk to me, Sarah," Sullivan said quietly as she worked to repair internal damage. "What's the history here?" Sarah was quiet for so long that Sullivan thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, without looking up from her work, she began to speak. "Tommy and I served together for 3 years. Same unit, same missions. Somewhere along the way we became more than just teammates." Her voice was steady, but Sullivan could hear the pain underneath. "We were good together. Really good. He was the best officer I ever served under, and I thought we had a future. What happened? Operation Red Dawn, small village near the Pakistan border. Intelligence said it was a Taliban stronghold, but when we got there..." Sarah paused, her hands stilling for a moment. "It was a trap. The whole thing was set up to draw us in. We lost 6 men that day. Good men who trusted Tommy's leadership and my medical skills." Sullivan began to understand. In special operations, when missions went wrong, someone had to take responsibility. Leaders carried the weight of their decisions, and medics carried the weight of everyone they couldn't save. Tommy blamed himself for walking us into an ambush. I blamed myself for not being able to save everyone who got hurt. Instead of helping each other through it, we pulled apart. The guilt was too much, and being together just reminded us of what we'd lost. Sarah resumed her work, her movements more determined now. I requested a transfer 6 months later. Haven't seen him since. Until now. Until now. Sullivan watched Sarah continue her work, understanding now why this case was so critical. She wasn't just trying to save a former patient or teammate. She was trying to save someone she had loved, someone whose loss had shaped the course of her entire life. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, and Sullivan found himself hoping desperately that her skills would be enough. As if sensing his thoughts, Sarah looked up from her work with determination burning in her eyes. "He's not dying on my watch," she said firmly. "Not this time." The extraction helicopter couldn't land in their current position due to enemy fire, forcing the combined teams to move 2 kilometers through hostile territory with a critically wounded patient. Sarah had managed to stabilize Chen temporarily, but he needed a surgical facility within hours, or he wouldn't survive the journey back to base. As they prepared to move out, Sullivan found himself taking operational command of the combined SEAL and Ranger elements, coordinating their movement while Sarah focused on keeping Chen alive during transport. It was a delicate balance, moving fast enough to get Chen the help he needed while staying quiet enough to avoid the enemy patrols that intelligence indicated were searching for them. The first kilometer went smoothly. Sarah had rigged a portable IV system and was monitoring Chen's vitals while 2 Rangers carried his stretcher. She moved alongside them with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every minute counted. Sullivan found himself constantly checking on her, noting how she seemed to draw strength from being back in her element despite the emotional cost. It was Morrison who first noticed they were being followed. "Movement on R6, he reported quietly through the radio. "At least 8 combatants, maybe more." Sullivan made the decision that every military leader dreads: continue the mission and risk engagement, or find a defensive position and risk losing the patient. With Chen's condition deteriorating, there really wasn't a choice. "We keep moving," he decided. "Morrison, take your men and establish a rear guard. We'll get Chen to the extraction point." As the Rangers fell back to provide cover, Sarah found herself running alongside Chen's stretcher, trying to maintain medical care while navigating rough mountain terrain. It was exactly the kind of scenario that special operations medics trained for, but training and reality were always different things. "His blood pressure is dropping," Sarah reported to Sullivan. "We need to move faster. Contact rear." Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, followed immediately by the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire echoing off the mountain walls. Sullivan's mind raced through their options. The enemy had found them. The extraction point was still a kilometer away and their patient was dying. In situations like this, conventional wisdom said to call for immediate evacuation, even if it meant landing the helicopter in a hot zone. But Sullivan had spent enough time around special operations units to know that sometimes conventional wisdom got people killed. "Sarah," he called as they continued moving toward the extraction point. "How long can you keep him stable?" "Maybe 30 minutes if we're lucky," she replied, checking Chen's pulse while still jogging alongside the stretcher. "His body is shutting down." The sound of gunfire behind them was getting closer, indicating that Morrison's rear guard was being pushed back. Sullivan could see the clearing ahead where the helicopter was supposed to land, but it was still several hundred meters away, and the enemy was closing fast. That's when Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone. "Put him down," she ordered the stretcher bearers. "Doc, we need to keep moving." One of the Rangers protested. "Put him down now." Sarah's voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had been in command before. "I'm going to perform emergency surgery right here." Sullivan stared at her in disbelief. "Sarah, we're in the middle of a firefight. Tommy's going to die if I don't stop this internal bleeding in the next 10 minutes, she replied, already pulling surgical instruments from her medical bag. "And he's definitely going to die if we keep bouncing him around on this stretcher." It was an impossible situation with no good options. Sullivan looked at the determination in Sarah's eyes and made a command decision that went against every tactical manual he had ever read. "Do it," he ordered. "We'll hold them off." Sullivan positioned his SEALs in a defensive perimeter around Sarah and Chen while she prepared to perform battlefield surgery under the worst possible conditions. The sound of gunfire was getting steadily closer, and everyone knew that their position was rapidly becoming untenable. "Talk to me, Sarah," Sullivan said as he checked his weapon and prepared to engage the advancing enemy. "How long do you need?" 20 minutes minimum, she replied, her hands already working to open Chen's abdomen and locate the source of the bleeding. "Maybe more if there are complications." "We don't have 20 minutes. "Then we make 20 minutes. Sullivan had to admire her determination, even as he calculated the odds of their survival. Morrison's voice on the radio confirmed what he already suspected. The enemy force was larger than initially estimated, and the rearguard was running low on ammunition. "Extraction bird is 10 minutes out," the pilot reported over the radio. "But I can't land in a hot zone." "Understood," Sullivan replied. "We'll clear the landing zone." What followed were the longest 20 minutes of Sullivan's military career. His SEALs held their defensive positions while Morrison's Rangers conducted a fighting withdrawal, slowly falling back toward their position. Sarah worked with laser focus on Chen's wounds, ignoring the bullets whining overhead and the explosions from enemy grenades that were getting progressively closer. "Almost got it," Sarah muttered, her hands deep inside Chen's abdomen as she worked to repair damaged blood vessels. "Just need a few more minutes. Doc, we need to move now." Morrison's voice was urgent as his team reached their perimeter, bringing the enemy contact dangerously close to Sarah's improvised operating table. "2 more minutes," Sarah insisted, not looking up from her work. Sullivan found himself faced with another impossible decision. They could abandon the surgery and risk Chen dying during evacuation, or they could hold position and risk everyone dying in a firefight they couldn't win. "Give her the 2 minutes," he decided, then keyed his radio. "All positions, we hold here for 2 more minutes. Then we run for the extraction point." It was during those final 2 minutes that Sullivan truly understood what Sarah had gone through during her time with the Rangers. Performing life-saving surgery while under enemy fire required a level of mental discipline and emotional control that few people possessed. Watching her work, completely focused on her patient despite the chaos around her, he realized that her transfer to regular medical duties hadn't been about lacking courage or skill. It had been about a warrior who had given too much of herself and needed time to heal. "Done," Sarah announced, quickly closing the surgical site. "Let's get him out of here." The evacuation to the helicopter was a running firefight, with both SEAL and Ranger elements providing covering fire, while the stretcher team sprinted across the open ground to the landing zone. Sarah ran alongside Chen, monitoring his condition and adjusting his IV fluid as bullets kicked up dirt around their feet. When they finally reached the helicopter and loaded Chen aboard, Sullivan saw tears streaming down Sarah's face, not from fear but from relief. She had done the impossible, saving a life under conditions that most surgeons would consider hopeless. As the helicopter lifted off and headed back to base, Sullivan found himself looking at Sarah with new respect. He was beginning to understand that her story wasn't just about a medic who had transferred to quieter duties. It was about a warrior who had paid a price for her service that few people could understand, and who was still paying it every day. Chen survived the surgery, but his recovery would take weeks. During those first critical days back at the base, Sarah barely left his bedside. Sullivan watched her maintain a vigil that went far beyond professional duty, and he began to understand that the story she had told him about their relationship was only part of the truth. It was on the 3rd night, when Chen was finally stable enough to speak coherently, that the full story began to emerge. Sullivan was checking on the wounded when he overheard a conversation that changed everything he thought he knew about Sarah Martinez. "I thought you were dead," Chen whispered to Sarah, his voice weak but filled with emotion. "I know," Sarah replied, adjusting his IV. "I'm sorry I let you think that. The explosion in Kandahar. Your gear was found in the rubble. There was so much blood. We held a memorial service, Sarah. I spoke at your funeral." Sullivan stepped back into the shadows, realizing he was overhearing something intensely private. But what he heard next made it impossible to walk away. "I couldn't come back," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "After what happened to Maria and Jackson, after I failed them so completely, I couldn't face you or the unit. I couldn't face the families of the people I couldn't save." "So you faked your own death?" "Not exactly. The explosion knocked me unconscious, and when I woke up in a field hospital 3 days later, they told me everyone thought I was dead. It seemed easier to let them keep thinking that. I requested a transfer under a different identity, started over as a regular Navy corpsman." Sullivan felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Sarah hadn't just transferred from special operations. She had completely reinvented herself, abandoning her former identity and everyone who knew her. The woman he had been working with for the past week was essentially a ghost. "Maria Rodriguez and Jackson Webb," Chen continued, and Sullivan could hear the pain in his voice. "They died because I made the wrong call on that mission. Not because you couldn't save them. I was the medic, Sarah insisted. It was my job to bring everyone home. It was my job to keep everyone safe in the first place. You can't save someone who's already dead, Sarah. Maria and Jackson were killed instantly in that secondary explosion. There was nothing you could have done. Sullivan had heard enough. He quietly backed away from the medical tent, his mind reeling from what he had learned. Sarah Martinez, the competent but seemingly ordinary Navy corpsman who had been assigned to his team, was actually a highly decorated special operations medic who had been officially declared dead 3 years ago. The implications were staggering. The next morning, Sullivan found Sarah sitting outside the medical tent staring at the sunrise with hollow eyes. She looked like someone who had spent the night confronting ghosts. "Rough night?" he asked, sitting down beside her. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of resignation and wariness. "How much did you hear?" "Enough to understand why you've been running." Sullivan kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "The question is, what happens now?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun climb higher in the desert sky. "I don't know," she admitted. "For 3 years I've been living a lie. I thought I could leave the past behind, start fresh, maybe find some peace. But seeing Tommy again, saving his life, it's brought everything back." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Sullivan suggested. "Maybe it's time to stop running." "You don't understand," Sarah said, her voice filled with self-recrimination. "I abandoned my unit, let them think I was dead, caused them to grieve for someone who was perfectly fine. Tommy spoke at my funeral. How do you come back from something like that?" Sullivan considered his words carefully. In his experience, the hardest wounds to heal were the ones that people inflicted on themselves. You start by forgiving yourself for being human, and then you decide whether you want to keep hiding from who you really are. Before Sarah could respond, Chief Johnson approached them with a concerned expression. "Martinez, we need to talk," he said. "There's been a development." They followed Johnson to the communications tent where a secure message was waiting on the terminal. As Sarah read it, Sullivan watched her face go pale. "What is it?" he asked. "Orders," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm being reassigned immediately. They want me to report to Special Operations Command for debriefing." Sullivan felt a chill run down his spine. "Someone found out who you really are." "Looks like it." Sarah stared at the orders with a mixture of fear and resignation. "My commanding officer wants answers about why a dead Special Operations medic has been serving under false identity for 3 years. The weight of the situation began to sink in. Sarah wasn't just facing the end of her carefully constructed new life. She was potentially facing court-martial for desertion, fraud, and who knew what other charges the military could come up with. The consequences could include prison time, dishonorable discharge, and the complete destruction of any future she might have hoped to build. "There has to be something we can do," Sullivan said, his mind already working through possibilities. Character witnesses, extenuating circumstances, PTSD claims. "Jake," Sarah said quietly, using his first name for the first time. "I've been living a lie for 3 years. I let my unit think I was dead, caused them pain they didn't deserve, and violated more military regulations than I can count. There's no coming back from that." But Sullivan wasn't ready to give up. Over the past week, he had watched Sarah save lives with skills that most medics could only dream of having. He had seen her perform miracle surgery under impossible conditions, watched her care for his wounded men with a combination of competence and compassion that was rare in any profession. The idea of losing someone like that to military bureaucracy and regulations seemed like a terrible waste. "Maybe not," he said thoughtfully, "but there might be another way." Sarah looked at him with cautious hope. "What do you mean?" Sullivan was quiet for a moment, formulating a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. "What if you didn't go back as Sarah Martinez the deserter? What if you went back as the special operations medic who performed a miracle rescue under fire, saved the life of a fellow soldier, and proved that reports of her death had been greatly exaggerated?" "You want me to tell them the truth?" "I want you to tell them a better truth. The truth about who you really are, what you're capable of, and why the military needs people like you more than it needs to punish past mistakes." Sarah considered this for a long moment, then looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of hope. "That's either the best idea I've heard in 3 years, she said slowly, or the worst." "Only one way to find out," Sullivan replied, "but either way you won't be going back alone." I'm going with you. The flight back to Special Operations Command headquarters at MacDill Air Force Base felt like a journey to Judgment Day. Sarah sat rigidly in her seat, wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 3 years, while Sullivan reviewed the testimonial statements he had gathered from every member of his SEAL team. Each statement detailed Sarah's exceptional medical skills, her courage under fire, and her critical role in saving multiple lives during their recent operations. "Remember," Sullivan said as their plane began its descent, "you're not Sarah Martinez, the deserter. You're Dr. Sarah Chen, Special Operations Medic, who survived against all odds and continued serving her country under extraordinary circumstances." Sarah had legally reverted to her maiden name during the transfer process, a small detail that Sullivan hoped would help frame her story in a more positive light. It was a slim hope, but better than facing the tribunal with no hope at all. The hearing was scheduled for 1400 hours in a sterile conference room that felt more like a courtroom. Sarah entered to find a panel of 3 senior officers waiting for her: Colonel Martinez from Army Special Operations, Captain Thompson from Naval Special Warfare, and Major General Williams from Joint Special Operations Command. Their expressions were unreadable, but the thick files in front of each officer suggested they had done their homework. "Dr. Chen," Colonel Martinez began, emphasizing her real name. "Or should we call you Hospital Corpsman Martinez? It seems you've been using quite a few identities over the past 3 years." "Sarah Chen is my legal name, sir," Sarah replied, standing at attention. "I reverted to it following my divorce. Divorce from a marriage that your commanding officers were never informed of," Captain Thompson noted, consulting his file, "along with a great many other details about your personal life that seem to have been creatively omitted from your service record." Sullivan, who had been granted permission to attend as a character witness, watched the proceedings with growing concern. The officers weren't interested in hearing about Sarah's recent heroics. They were focused on the bureaucratic irregularities and the apparent deception that had allowed her to serve under a false identity. "Let's start at the beginning," Major General Williams said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers. "Operation Red Dawn 3 years ago. According to the official report, Special Operations Medic Sarah Chen was killed in a secondary explosion while treating wounded soldiers. Her body was never recovered, but sufficient evidence was found to declare her dead. Yet here you sit, very much alive. Explain." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine the rest of her life. "Sir, I was critically injured in that explosion and evacuated to a field hospital while unconscious. When I regained consciousness 3 days later, I learned that my unit had been told I was dead. Medical personnel at the hospital confirmed that my personal effects had been found at the blast site, and that blood evidence suggested fatal injuries. So you decided to let everyone continue believing you were dead?" "Initially, yes, sir. I was not in a good mental state following that mission. We had lost 6 soldiers, including 2 who died while I was treating them. I felt responsible for their deaths. And the idea of facing their families, of facing Lieutenant Chen and my unit, was more than I could handle at the time. So you committed fraud instead?" Colonel Martinez said bluntly. Sullivan stood up. "Permission to speak, sir?" The panel looked at him with mild irritation, but Major General Williams nodded. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, you've submitted extensive documentation about Dr. Chen's recent service. What's your assessment of her character and capabilities?" "Sir, in my opinion, Sarah Chen is one of the most skilled and dedicated medical professionals I've ever worked with. Over the past month, she has saved the lives of multiple service members under combat conditions, including performing battlefield surgery that most trauma surgeons would consider impossible. Her actions during our recent operation in the mountains directly resulted in the survival of Lieutenant Chen and several other wounded soldiers." "That may be," Captain Thompson replied, "but exceptional medical skills don't excuse desertion, fraud, and conduct unbecoming an officer. With respect, sir," Sullivan continued, "Dr. Chen never deserted. She continued serving, continued saving lives, continued putting herself at risk for her fellow service members. The fact that she did so under difficult personal circumstances should be considered a testament to her dedication, not grounds for punishment." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward Sullivan, But she also knew that the panel wasn't likely to be swayed by character references alone. They needed to understand the whole truth, not just the version that made her look sympathetic. "Sir," she said, addressing Major General Williams directly, "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan is being generous in his assessment, but the truth is more complicated. I didn't just continue serving, I ran away. I abandoned my responsibilities, my unit, and my identity because I couldn't cope with the psychological trauma of losing soldiers under my care." The room fell silent as Sarah continued. "For 3 years I've been trying to convince myself that I was serving honorably in my new assignment, but the reality is that I was hiding. I was too afraid to face the consequences of my perceived failures, so I let good people grieve for someone who was still alive. That was wrong, and I accept full responsibility for the pain I caused." Major General Williams studied her for a long moment. "And what changed? Why are you here now?" "Accepting responsibility instead of continuing to hide." Sarah glanced at Sullivan, then back at the panel. "Because I realized that running away doesn't honor the memory of the soldiers who died. Maria Rodriguez and Jackson Webb deserved better from me than cowardice and deception, and Lieutenant Chen deserved to know that I was alive, regardless of the personal cost to me." "You understand that the charges against you are serious?" Colonel Martinez asked. "Fraud, conduct unbecoming, failure to report status changes, potential desertion depending on how we interpret your actions." "I understand, sir, and I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences the panel deems appropriate." Major General Williams conferred quietly with the other officers for several minutes before addressing Sarah again. "Dr. Chen, your case presents some unique circumstances. Your medical skills are clearly exceptional, and your recent service record is exemplary. However, the irregularities in your service history and the deception involved in your identity change are serious matters that cannot be overlooked." Sarah braced herself for the verdict, knowing that her military career was likely over regardless of the panel's decision. "We're prepared to offer you a choice," the general continued. "You can face a court-martial for the charges I mentioned, with the possibility of significant penalties including imprisonment and dishonorable discharge. Or," Sarah held her breath, "you can accept a voluntary discharge with an other than honorable characterization, immediate termination of your current assignment, and a lifetime ban from military service." Sullivan felt his heart sink. Either option would effectively end Sarah's career and punish her for 3 years of exceptional service under impossible circumstances. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, "may I request a third option?" The panel exchanged surprised glances. "You're in no position to negotiate, Doctor." "I'm not negotiating, sir. I'm requesting the opportunity to serve. My actions over the past 3 years were wrong, and I accept responsibility for them. But I'm also asking you to consider what I can contribute to the military going forward. My skills are rare. My experience is extensive, and there are soldiers who are alive today because of what I was able to do for them." Sarah straightened to full attention. "I'm requesting the opportunity to serve openly, under my real name and identity, in whatever capacity the military deems appropriate. I'm willing to accept any rank reduction, any assignment, any conditions you see fit to impose. But I'm asking for the chance to serve honorably, to use my skills where they're needed most, and to make amends for my past mistakes through future service." The room fell silent as the panel considered this unexpected request. It was a gamble that could either save Sarah's career or make her punishment even worse. But Sullivan found himself admiring her courage in making it. After what felt like an eternity, Major General Williams spoke. "We'll take your request under advisement. This hearing is adjourned pending our decision." As they filed out of the conference room, Sullivan caught up with Sarah in the hallway. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said. Sarah managed a weak smile. "Probably both, but at least I finally told the truth." The call came 3 weeks later while Sarah was staying at a small hotel near the base, waiting for the panel's decision. She had spent the time visiting with Chen, who was recovering well and had forgiven her more easily than she had forgiven herself. Their relationship had evolved into something new, not the romance they had once shared, but a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what they had both survived. "Dr. Chen, please report to Major General Williams' office at 800 tomorrow," the voice on the phone said. No indication of what the decision might be. No hint of whether she should prepare for redemption or punishment. Sullivan had returned to his unit but had stayed in touch daily, providing moral support and helping Sarah navigate the complex emotions of confronting her past. When she called to tell him about the summons, he immediately arranged to be present for whatever came next. "Whatever happens," he told her over the phone, "you did the right thing. You faced the truth, and that took more courage than most people ever have to show." The next morning, Sarah walked into Major General Williams' office wearing her dress uniform and carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had finally stopped running from who she was. Sullivan was already there, along with Colonel Martinez and Captain Thompson, but there was also someone else, a woman in army dress uniform with the rank insignia of a full colonel and the medical branch insignia of a surgeon. "Dr. Chen," Major General Williams began, "I'd like you to meet Colonel Patricia Hayes, Director of Special Operations Medical Training. She's here because your case has generated considerable interest at the highest levels of the medical command." Colonel Hayes stepped forward with a professional smile. "Dr. Chen, I've reviewed your service record, both the official version and the more complete picture that's emerged from recent events. Your skills are quite remarkable." Sarah felt a flicker of hope but kept her expression neutral. "Thank you, ma'am. The panel has reached a decision regarding your case," Major General Williams continued. "Given the unique circumstances involved and the critical need for experienced special operations medical personnel, we're prepared to offer you an unusual arrangement." Sarah braced herself, unsure whether this was good news or bad news. "You will receive a formal reprimand for the administrative irregularities in your service record," the general said. "This will remain in your permanent file. However, you will not face court-martial, and you will not be discharged from service." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief, but the general wasn't finished. "Instead, you are being transferred to a new position with Colonel Hayes' organization. You'll be responsible for training the next generation of special operations medics, passing on the skills and experience that make you so valuable in the field. Your rank will be reduced 1 grade as punishment for your actions, but you'll be eligible for promotion based on performance in your new role." Colonel Hayes stepped forward again. "Dr. Chen, we're offering you the opportunity to help create the most advanced special operations medical training program in the world. You'll be working with the best and brightest medics from all services, teaching them not just medical procedures, but the mental resilience and tactical awareness that allowed you to perform miracles under impossible conditions." Sarah looked around the room, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "You want me to train other medics?" "We want you to create a new standard for what special operations medics can achieve," Colonel Hayes replied. "Your experience, both positive and negative, gives you insights that can't be learned from textbooks. The psychological challenges of battlefield medicine, the weight of responsibility for other people's lives, the way trauma can affect decision-making, these are things that can only be taught by someone who's lived through them." Sullivan stepped forward. "There's more, Sarah. The Navy is also interested in having you work with our corpsmen. This would be a joint service assignment, training medics from all branches of the military." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. After 3 years of hiding, of believing that her career was over and that she had nothing to offer, she was being given the opportunity to serve in a way that could impact countless future medics and the soldiers they would treat. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Major General Williams replied with the first smile she had seen from him. "Say you're ready to stop running and start teaching others how to save lives the way you've been doing." "Yes," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." Colonel Hayes handed her a folder containing her new orders. "Your first assignment is to develop a curriculum for psychological resilience training. We want medics who can function under extreme stress without breaking the way." She paused tactfully. "Without facing the challenges you've overcome." Sarah nodded, understanding the implication. Her breakdown and subsequent recovery could become a teaching tool, a way to help other medics recognize and cope with the psychological demands of their profession before those demands became overwhelming. As the meeting concluded and they prepared to leave, Sullivan pulled Sarah aside. "So what now?" he asked. "Back to hiding behind medical textbooks and training scenarios?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, it was a smile without shadows behind it. "No more hiding. I think it's time to figure out who Sarah Chen really is when she's not running from her past." "And who might that be?" Sarah considered the question seriously. Someone who's learned that you can't save everyone, but that doesn't mean you stop trying. Someone who understands that facing your failures is harder than hiding from them, but it's the only way to truly serve others. And someone who's finally ready to help other people avoid making the same mistakes she made. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of her first class of special operations medics, looking at 20 young faces that reminded her of herself at their age. Eager, confident, and completely unprepared for the psychological reality of what they were about to face. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen," she began, "and I'm going to teach you how to save lives under the worst possible conditions. But more importantly, I'm going to teach you how to save yourself when saving others becomes more than you think you can handle." In the back of the classroom, Sullivan watched with pride as Sarah began to share not just her medical knowledge, but the hard-won wisdom that had emerged from her journey through failure, loss, and redemption. She had finally found her way home, not to the person she had been before the trauma, but to someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than she could have imagined. The woman who had once been so broken by her failures that she had faked her own death was now helping others find the strength to face their own challenges with courage and hope. It was, Sullivan thought, exactly the kind of miracle that Sarah Chen specialized in creating.